Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about how the Viking people were so resilient and could tolerate being uncomfortable. They did this by surviving Scandinavian winters without central heating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the bright lights. Perhaps switch on a fan for a soft background hum, or a space heater if you want to feel historical. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the temperature outside got really low, the Vikings didn't worry. They just went back to their longhouses, which were big, low buildings that weren't much better at keeping in air than a modern sauna built inside a cow. These long houses were like winter bunkers for the Vikings. It was mostly made from wood if you lived near trees, or stone if you didn't. They were built low to the ground to keep the heat in and wide enough to fit multiple families. In some cases, there was even space for a few cows because sleeping next to something that chews cud and farts steam is not a comfortable experience. The key to surviving the cold was to keep warm together. Imagine a long house as a big shared battery. People, animals, and a fire pit are all working together in a cozy, airless way. It was less a house and more a survival bunker. The hearth was in the middle of the longhouse. It was used as a stove and as a space heater. There were no chimneys because they hadn't been invented yet. Or, to be more exact, they had been invented, but not in places where people still used bones as doorstops. Instead, smoke rose and collected in the rafters, sometimes finding its way out through a hole in the roof or staying right where it was, turning the ceiling black and making everyone's lungs feel like wool-lined ashtrays. Viking homes might seem unbearably smoky, crowded, and oddly intimate to modern eyes, and that's because they were. But for the Vikings, it was the best option apart from becoming a snow sculpture. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, often stuffed with straw, moss, or other soft materials that could catch fire. Families, and sometimes their goats, all slept in the same space. It wasn't because they loved each other that much, but because they needed each other's warmth and privacy. To put it briefly, Viking longhouses weren't comfortable, but they were practical. They kept people alive during harsh winters, even if they didn't make them feel comfortable or let them rest. Viking fashion was not about looking good on the catwalk. It was about keeping warm. The Norse were great at layering. We're talking full-body wool armor, made even better with fur and leather, and with no sense of shame. The base layer, linen, if you had some. Linen was light, breathable, and good at wicking sweat. Unfortunately, it also tore easily and was expensive to make, which is why most people skipped straight to wool. Lots of wool. Viking men wore tunics over trousers with leg wraps. These were basically ancient thermal leggings. Women wore long, woolly dresses, layered with aprons and cloaks. Everyone wore belts to keep things together and pouches to carry whatever was needed. Things like knives, flint, a type of rock that can be used to make fire, or maybe a piece of emergency cheese. Cloaks were essential. They were fastened with brooches and sometimes lined with fur. If you didn't have one, you probably didn't have much time left. Boots were made of animal hide, often from cattle or seals, and were waterproofed using lots of fat. Viking footwear wasn't pretty, but it was grease-sealed and windproof. The only bad thing was that you smelled like a place where they make jerky. For the really dedicated, intestines were sometimes used to make waterproof layers. Yes, I'm talking about real animal guts. I cleaned it, scraped it, dried it, and sewed it into a kind of raincoat. It wasn't breathable, but it did keep out snow and rain. Nobody was going to care what you were wearing when you were covered in internal organs. People wore hats, mittens, and scarves made from felted wool. This is wool that has been beaten until it has no shape and is very warm and thick. If you didn't have gloves, you put your hands in your cloak and hoped that no one noticed your fingers turning blue. When it came to surviving cold Scandinavian nights, the Vikings had one culinary rule: eat as if your life depends on it, because it does. Calories weren't a treat, they were protection. Viking winter food wasn't fancy, but it was filling, rich, and quite boldly practical. Let's start with the most important things. Things like meat, dairy, grain, and preserved fish. There are lots of preserved fish. They smoked it, salted it, dried it, fermented it, and then said sorry to no one. Lutefisk, for example, is white fish soaked in lies until it's a mix of food and dare. They're not delicious, but they don't go bad. People use stews for heartier meals. The Vikings threw everything they had into a pot over the fire. Cuts of meat, root vegetables, oats, and even sour milk. The longer it cooks, the better. The result wasn't glamorous, but it stuck to your ribs and possibly to the bowl. Dairy was something people ate all year, but especially in winter. Cheese and butter were made during the warmer months and stored for the cold season. They were not as nice and creamy as brie. Think hard about those hard, salty, wheel-shaped pucks of milk that are so important for survival. It's great for gnawing, trading, or throwing at wolves. They also made sky, which was a mixture of yogurt and cheese, and definitely a Viking version of you'll eat it and you'll be grateful. It was full of protein and had a strong sour taste. It was like a slap in the face for your taste buds, but made you feel lively. Grains were stored in large quantities. Barley and rye were used to make flatbreads and porridge. Viking bread was dense, dark, and sometimes made with crushed tree bark to use up more flour. It wasn't tasty, but if your blood sugar stayed above a certain level, it was doing its job. And finally, alcohol. Ale and mead weren't just for special celebrations. They were warm, slightly antiseptic, and really comforting when your toes had gone numb. They especially made you forget that you lived in a smoky shed with animals and 6 other people. And if it tasted terrible, even better, because no one would want to eat your leftovers. When winter hit hard, and in Scandinavia it always did, Vikings turned to their most reliable source of heat: other mammals. It wasn't thought of as strange to bring animals indoors. It was considered efficient. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, and even cattle were invited inside Viking longo uses, not for companionship, but for body warmth. Imagine a medieval system of central heating that is powered by the milk of a cow. The animals were usually kept in a part of the longhouse called the byre. The garage meat is basically the stable part of the structure. A low dividing wall kept animals and humans semi-separate. When we say semi-separated, we mean that they're close enough to smell, but not close enough to pet without causing problems. On very cold nights, the lines between people and places became less clear. A family might get closer to the byre. Children might nap beside sheep. If the ox was warm and willing, congratulations, that was your pillow now. It's not comfortable, but works really well. The logic was simple. Animals generate heat. A cow can produce as much warmth as a small campfire, and it doesn't need any kindling. In very cold weather, that warmth could mean the difference between waking up frostbitten and only slightly annoyed by the snoring pig. But the side effects were not very nice. You had to deal with the noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof in the wrong place. But the Vikings didn't complain. They understood something that everyone should know. Warmth now, dignity later. It wasn't just about the heat either. Keeping animals close protected them from theft, predators, and freezing to death outside. Livestock were very important to the family. They used the animals to provide food, warmth, and a way to transport goods. Long houses were often designed with this in mind. The builders made the house feel warm and inviting. It was architecture by survival instinct. Simple, effective, and fragrant. Vikings weren't just able to survive the cold. They put up with it, and they were actually pretty happy about it. When the fire got low, the goats got restless, and the smoke turned your long house into a barbecue pit, you still had one last defense against the cold: each other. Huddling wasn't just about feeling warm. It was community engineering. Families slept on raised platforms covered in wool, and whatever scraps of hide were not being used to patch the roof. Privacy was just a myth. It was a rumor that it was comfortable, but it was warm and everyone felt the same. Children sat between adults. The elderly were treated like valuable historical objects. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were thermal devices with whiskers. Everyone squashed together, breathing in each other's smoky cabbage-scented air and pretending they couldn't hear Uncle Bjorn snoring like a hurt elk. But this wasn't just about surviving physically. If you spend too long on your own in winter, you might start to feel confused and upset. That's where Viking humor came in. Rough, blunt, and strangely effective. They told stories and sang songs, often about brave warriors who died heroically from freezing, which made everyone feel better. They teased each other with sharp wit and no holds barred. There is no better way to beat the winter blues than by laughing at your cousin for falling in the toilet last week. Eating and drinking together was another important way to boost morale. During the mid-interval, food that had been saved since autumn was brought out in large amounts. This was not just to celebrate Yule, but also to remind everyone that they were still alive and that they had turnips. Vikings also held games and competitions inside, sometimes including riddles, board games like a kind of protocast with more betrayal, or wrestling matches that occasionally knocked over the livestock. The goal wasn't just to entertain. It was a way to take my mind off the cold, the dark, and the fact that spring might never come. But most of all, they survived winter because they thought it would be hard. There was no complaining and no feeling that they deserved to be made comfortable. It was always sad. Anything better would be a bonus. Insulation is usually made from fiberglass, foam, or other high-tech materials. These materials have brand names and warning labels. The Vikings did not have this luxury. Their plan to protect people from the cold was simple. Try to fill your walls with as much natural material as you can and hope it holds. A Viking longhouse wasn't just a shack with holes in the walls. It was actually designed that way. These homes were built to keep in heat, using whatever materials they could find. If you lived near forests, you used timber. If you didn't, you used turf and stone. The walls were very thick, sometimes up to a meter, and the idea was to trap heat. They filled the logs or stones with moss, straw, mud, or animal hair. Stuff that was fibrous, dense, and a bit warm-smelling was put into the cracks. It wasn't glamorous, and you probably didn't want to lean against the walls barefoot, but it worked. Roofs were often thatched or made of sod, which is just grass and dirt. This wasn't just some design trend for eco-friendly hipsters. Turf roofs kept the house warm and dry, and sometimes, if the conditions were right, they allowed weeds or mushrooms to grow. Gardening inside, maybe like an accidental salad bar, possibly. The floor was usually just packed earth, sometimes with straw or rushes on top, which were replaced regularly. And by periodically, we mean whenever the smell could no longer be explained as being caused by rust. Windows were rare and small, if they existed at all. Fire and smoke holes provided the light. Why no big windows? Because glass was expensive, it was dangerous to have any light in the house. And Vikings did not care much about natural light when it was pitch black outside for 3 months anyway. Even though this quick collection of wood, grass, and other natural materials was put together without much thought, it actually worked really well. It made the longhouse feel like a slow cooker full of people's body heat and smelly goat breath, and it could handle the Scandinavian winter. It wasn't a spa. It wasn't breathable. It probably didn't meet the requirements of modern building codes, but it kept Viking families alive, warm and smelly enough to preserve their food and confuse insects. When the fire went out and the wind howled outside like an angry frost demon, Vikings had a time-tested way of surviving the night. Sleep like your life depends on it, because it does. Vikings' sleeping arrangements were more about keeping warm than having separate bedrooms. Whole families, sometimes including distant relatives and any livestock that was not well, slept on raised wooden platforms along the long walls of the house. The beds were covered with straw, moss, or hay, and filled with fur, wool, and resignation. There were no sheets, duvets, or embroidered pillowcases. If it was soft and didn't bite, it went on the bed. Everyone slept in their clothes. It was very cold, so it was a good idea to put on lots of layers before going to bed. Boots were sometimes even worn to bed. If that sounds ridiculous, remember that frostbite doesn't care about your dignity. Babies were wrapped up and held close. Children were often placed between parents or older brothers and sisters, not because it was good for their emotional development, but because it was easier to look after them. It was basically a meat loaf made of people and wool. Couples slept together, of course, but so did anyone who could fit in. Modesty was not a priority. If someone's feet got a little cold, that was just part of surviving, not something to get excited about. People wrapped wool cloaks around their bodies like medieval thermal blankets. Animal hides, especially from reindeer or bears, made them even warmer. If you had a blanket made of animal skin, you were either very rich or very lucky or very committed to hunting scary things in winter. In richer homes or during really cold winters, heated stones or bricks were sometimes placed under the bedding. Yes, the Vikings had their own version of a hot water bottle, but it was heavier and more likely to burn your thigh. And if the fire in the hearth went out during the night, you didn't relight it right away. You pulled someone closer and said something in Old Norse that probably meant, "Don't steal the fur again." Sleeping in a Viking long house wasn't glamorous. It was smoky, cramped, and there was a 100% chance of snoring. But it worked. The smoke should have drifted up and escaped through the thatched roof or a vent near the top of the structure. In practice, it stuck to the ceiling and slowly got into everyone's lungs. You didn't breathe fresh air in a Viking house. You breathed in the air of experience. By the end of a winter evening, your chest felt like it had smoked a pork shoulder, and so did the pork shoulder. Strangely, this wasn't all bad. The smoke helped to keep the meat and fish fresh. It also stops insects and mold from coming in. Also, the constant low-level exposure probably made every Viking's respiratory system as bad as a Victorian coal miner's. But there were some problems. People's eyes were red. They had coughs, and their ceilings were darker than Odin's mood. Children and old people probably suffer the most. This is because they are shorter and closer to the thickest parts of the smoke. Because physics is a bit of pain. Some families try to manage this by building raised platforms or sleeping closer to the ground to avoid the worst of the haze. Others just kept going, their eyes watering as they stirred stew or tried to find their bed without tripping over a half-cooked goat. A few Viking homes, the fancy kind, had smoke outlets in the roof. But for the average Norse family, smoke was just part of the atmosphere. It made you feel warm. It made your food taste better. And it reminded you every day that fire was both a friend and a dangerous health risk. If things got too smoky, you'd open a door, let in the fresh air, and freeze your toes off. When the days got really dark and the sun didn't shine for a month, the Vikings used a very old and very good way to survive. Celebration. You won't get too cold if you're having fun drinking and singing around a bonfire. Then there was Yule, the midwinter festival that was a mix of religion, a way of survival, and an excuse to eat whatever you could. It usually started around the winter solstice and lasted for days, sometimes even weeks, depending on how much mead there was. This wasn't just a party. It was a way to keep their spirits up. You made people feel better when morale was very low. It gave people something to look forward to besides not dying. Families got together. Animals were sacrificed for blessings and for dinner. And great fires were lit to symbolize the return of the sun. These weren't romantic little flames. These were extremely bright fires that practically dared the night to come closer. They ate preserved meat, drank ale and mead, told stories, played games, and sometimes they sang. And not politely either. Viking singing probably sounded like someone trying to charm a thunderstorm with a battle cry. The Yule log, now a cute dessert or decorative centerpiece, was originally a real log that burned for days. It was supposed to represent warmth and continuity and not freezing your family. It is both practical and symbolic. That's very Viking. There were also concerns about the supernatural. In winter, it was thought that ghosts, trolls, and restless ancestors would roam around. People made offerings and used charms to try and keep the peace and stop the spirits from stealing their goats. Many modern Christmas traditions actually come from Yule. The Norse liked evergreens, feasting, gift-giving, and bringing dead trees indoors. But most of all, Yule was about staying together. In a world without light switches, vitamin D supplements, or seasonal depression, the Vikings created joy from the beginning, using fire, food, and a strong belief that the cold would pass. Because it always did. And if it didn't, at least you went out with a full stomach and a story to tell. In old-time Scandinavia, gold was great, silver was even better, but wool was the most important thing. Wool wasn't just a material. It was a Viking's most important weapon against the cold, second only to fire and the occasional cuddle with a sheep. It was spun, woven, stitched, and layered into everything. This includes cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, underclothes, and blankets. If it could be made from wool, it was. The reason was simple. Wool is great. Cotton feels cold and wet, but wool keeps you warm and cozy even when it's damp. This is great when the weather is cold and foggy, making you feel even more miserable. In the past, sheep were kept by many families, especially in the countryside. Not because they were cute or for their wool, but because of the itchy skin condition that sometimes appeared on their backs. Spinning wool was a job that people did all year round. It was usually done by women and children. In winter, it became the closest thing to heating the future. The Vikings weren't interested in fashion for its own sake, but their wool clothes were surprisingly well made. Tunics were made to fit. The cloaks were cut to make it easier to move. Leg wraps were tied up neatly so that you wouldn't trip over yourself in the snow. The shape followed the function, and the warmth followed the shape. The quality of your wool actually said a lot about you. People who wore coarse wool were thought of as poor or practical. It is made of soft, tightly woven wool. That was luxury, the Viking equivalent of a cashmere hoodie. The rich Vikings could afford dyed wool, and sometimes they even imported colors like blue or red. Everyone else wore 37 different shades of sheep. And don't forget felt wool that had been soaked, stomped, and abused until it fused into a windproof mat. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, mittens, and sometimes to insulate walls. It felt like making fabric from rage and foot sweat. But it worked. People used to mend and repair their wool clothes and pass them down through their families. Nothing was wasted. Even wool scraps were used to make socks or stuffing. A good cloak could last for generations, as long as it didn't catch fire, blow away, or get buried with you when you went away. It may sound strange, but some of the coldest weather people in history also liked to make it even colder on purpose. The Vikings loved to sweat in the sauna and take ice baths. They didn't just want to live in the cold. They wanted to challenge it. Viking sweat lodges, called badtoffer, were small huts or pits built with stone and turf. Hot stones were placed in them and then doused with water to produce steam. You would be sitting inside half naked and sweating like a madman at a summer feast while the outside world froze. It was hot, humid, and smoky, and a welcome break from the icy reality of the outside world. Then, and this is where it gets interesting, some Vikings would run straight outside and jump into ice water or roll around in snow. They did this to improve their health. Or, to put it more realistically, they were trying to show the gods and anyone watching that they weren't afraid of anything, not even extreme cold. These hot and cold rituals weren't just about showing off. They were practical. Sweating helped cleanse the body, or at least made you feel like you were doing something about the fact you hadn't bathed properly in weeks. The extreme temperature changes also made your blood pump faster, cleared your sinuses, the cavities in your nose that help you breathe, and made you temporarily forget you lived in a world without insulation or painkillers. They also had a social function. Saunas were communal, which meant that families or groups sweated and froze together. Sometimes this was part of a ritual, and sometimes it was just a way to bond while slowly steaming their regrets. And, of course, steam rooms were also used as birthing rooms, healing spaces, and temporary hospitals. If something needed fixing, heating, or flushing out, the Viking answer was almost always, let's cook it first, then freeze it to get it really clean. These traditions worked so well that they have lasted to this day. In fact, many modern Nordic countries still have a tradition of using saunas, but these days they usually don't include goats. Surviving the cold was one thing. Dealing with the boredom was like its own kind of battle. The days were long and dark. The ground was frozen, and they couldn't go out to raid, sail, or plant anything for months. So the Vikings had to think of ways to keep busy inside without going crazy or killing their families. First, we need to do some repairs and prep work. In the winter, people would spend a lot of time sharpening weapons, fixing tools, rereading bows, and mending clothes. If your shirt had a hole in October, it was definitely fixed by candlelight in December. Unless you like frostbite in new places. Then there was spinning and weaving. Women, children, and anyone with two working hands spent a long time turning wool into yarn and yarn into clothes. It wasn't glamorous, but you knew your cloak didn't make itself. Every stitch of clothing was like another layer between you and death by the cold. Crafting was also important. Things made from wood, bone tools, and antler combs. Winter was when we started to think about making things look nice. The long house might look empty from the outside, but inside everyone was busy, and sometimes there was some swearing when someone dropped a needle. The most important thing was storytelling. The Vikings didn't have Netflix, but they did have sagas. Amazing stories about gods, heroes, monsters, and other family members who made bad decisions in their lives. These stories were passed down by firelight. Each retelling is slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect. They didn't just kill the giant. You probably punched the moon afterwards, too. Games help, too. Vikings played board games like Henneful, a strategy game that makes chess look like tic-tac-toe, and dice games that combined luck, bluffing, and possibly a little gambling. When things got really boring, some families would play riddles or put on pretend jewels. Alcohol made things easier. Mead made storytelling funnier and family arguments slightly more entertaining for those watching. The Vikings didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fires, and a questionable relationship with livestock. They fought it by thinking differently, not by looking at pretty pictures and feeling inspired. It was more like a strong, determined refusal to be impressed by nature trying to kill them. For most Norse people, winter was just part of life. It was just another day on the calendar, like planting season or time to raid France again. They weren't afraid of winter. They got ready for it, thought it would happen, and dealt with it by not caring. That wasn't an accident. Viking culture taught people from a young age to see hard times as a chance to test their strength. It wasn't failure. It was cold, it was painful, and it was hungry. That was a way of developing the character. You didn't complain. You kept going. Best if you make a face like you're in pain and say something rude about how this is better than dealing with taxes. This way of thinking wasn't just about culture, it was also about spirituality. Norse mythology is full of frost giants, endless winters, and gods who power through suffering like it's a normal day. When you believe that the world will end with a big, white, cold winter, you won't be scared of a little snow. This mental strength was also encouraged by society. Weakness wasn't laughed at. That's right. People just ignored it. No one wanted to be the one who couldn't handle the dark. So, people carried on. They were very busy. They joked about the cold. They laughed even though they were feeling sad. Then they filled a mug with tea and carried on making their 43rd mitten. Even children were taught to be strong. If your fingers were cold, you would use your elbows. If your toes were numb, walk faster. If you fell through ice and survived, congratulations. You were interesting enough to tell stories about. Was it healthy? Probably not. Does it work? Absolutely. Modern survival manuals talk about how important your mindset is. The Vikings already knew. They didn't see winter as something to be beaten. They saw it as a test, and one they had already passed many times before. And that's how they survived the coldest nights. They did this by making fires and wearing fur. They also showed that they did not care about the cold by raising their fists in the air. If there's one thing the Vikings understood better than most, it was this. No one survives winter alone. You can have the warmest cloak, the fattest goat, and the sturdiest longhouse. But without community, you're just a cold person with great accessories. Viking society was based on everyone working together. Families didn't live in isolation. They lived together in groups on farms, in villages, or in settlements. These groups were often made up of extended family members and close friends. When winter hit, this network was your lifeline. Everyone shared their food. Firewood was collected. If your roof collapsed, someone helped you fix it. If your child got sick, someone offered herbs, prayers, or at the very least, a sympathetic grunt. This wasn't just a kind act. It was just a matter of survival. The more people you kept alive through winter, the more hands you would come spring for farming, sailing, fighting, or just holding back the cows during calving season. Helping others helped yourself, even if that meant sharing your last smoked fish with a cousin you didn't like. During midwinter feasts like Yule, this bond was strengthened with food, storytelling, and a bit of boozing. These weren't just parties. They were important social events that helped keep people's spirits up and reminded everyone that they weren't facing the darkness alone. Even how they stored their resources showed this way of thinking. It wasn't unusual to find places where people shared food, places where meat was sold, and places where food was prepared and cooked. If one family ran out of supplies, the others would help. It wasn't just because it was polite, but because winter was long and one weak person could hold up the whole group. Justice and leadership were also important. Local leaders were responsible for keeping order and making sure nobody froze to death. Their reputation depended on their ability to manage both law and logistics. A respected leader was someone who could settle disputes and organize firewood collection. There was also peer pressure. If you tried to keep all the food to yourself or didn't do your chores, your neighbors would notice. In Viking society, being judged by the whole village was almost as bad as death. In the end, all that was left was the snow, the darkness, and the livestock snoring in your bed. The Vikings didn't just survive winter. They turned it into a place where they could test their skills. Every layer of wool, every puff of smoke, every grim joke around the hearth was part of a cultural plan designed for one purpose: survival. Winter wasn't an obstacle. It was an opponent. The Vikings trained all year for the match. They changed a lot. If the longhouse was too windy, they used moss to fill the gaps. If the stew was thin, they made it thicker with turnip. If the nights were long, they filled them with stories, games, and rituals. Sometimes they even had impromptu wrestling matches. There is no central heating. Okay, they built fire pits, but they didn't have any waterproof gear. They invented it out of stubbornness. I'm not taking any antidepressants. They had sagas, me, and the kind of dark humor that makes seasonal depression afraid to show up. Other civilizations got weaker in winter, but the Vikings used it to get stronger. Weapons were repaired, children were trained, and new ideas were shared around the fire. When the ice thawed, these people didn't suddenly appear in the sun. They were ready. You can start growing crops, building ships, making friends with other players, or sailing across oceans to warmer, richer places or places where you can plunder. Winter didn't make them weaker. It made them stronger, faster, and more aggressive. They were not born with a silver spoon in their mouths. It came from a never-ending, often smoky determination to survive by any means necessary. They slept under goats, sat in hot huts, and ate yogurt that also worked as a sealant. They did it together. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness. It was a place where people did not always survive and did not think much about education. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but uneducated farmer and carpenter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was quiet, gentle, and well-read, which was unusual for a woman on the frontier. They lived together in near poverty, growing crops on poor soil and finding wood for fuel in the woods. The cabin itself had no windows, no floor, and certainly no bookshelves. Abraham spent much of his early life in a world of candlelight, silence, and hard work. He would grow up doing simple jobs like chopping wood, carrying water, and wearing clothes made of patches. In the beginning, there was no proper education. In fact, Lincoln later said that he had less than a year of proper education in his whole life. But he had something more powerful. He was very keen and eager to learn. When Nancy Hanks died in 1818, possibly from milk sickness, Abraham was only 9 years old. When she died, it left a big gap in the boy's life that would never really get filled up. She had always been there for him, and she was the only one who could see the real him. After her burial, which was done by hand in the forest behind their farm, young Abe made a wooden marker himself. It was rough, basic, and full of emotion, but it said everything. He remembered her. A few months later, Thomas remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Sarah was not at all like the typical wicked stepmother. She was kind, and she made sure her children had plenty of books to read and that they had a well-planned schedule. She knew Lincoln was smart and helped him stay interested in things. Whenever he had a moment, he ate whatever he could find. Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. If he couldn't get a book, he'd write his own thoughts on wooden shingles using charcoal. This boy, with no shoes on and very thin, looked a bit too serious for his age. He was already making something inside himself. The world hadn't given him much. He didn't have any money or contacts, and it was really difficult for him. But he had a fire inside that he could not put out. Abraham Lincoln's journey to greatness began in a small cabin in the woods of Kentucky. As Lincoln grew up, life on the frontier was still very hard. If anything, it got harder. His family moved again. This time, we're going to the thick, swampy forests of Indiana. Every day was a struggle. They had to clear trees and plow through thick clay soil, and they had to survive brutal winters. They had little more than a hearth fire and hope. But while his body was shaped by the axe and the land, his mind was somewhere else. He was known to his neighbors not for his strength, though he was impressively strong, but for his height and his strange habit of reading every spare moment he had. He would carry books while walking, recite Shakespeare by heart while working on fences, and sit under trees, writing down his thoughts on any scrap paper he could find. He also started to get better at humor. Dry, observational, often funny about themselves. He was different. He was the gangly teen who quoted Jefferson, while others talked about their hunting experiences. Lincoln was not good at being social. He was shy but talkative, strange yet attractive. When he did speak, people listened. They couldn't help it. He spoke clearly and powerfully, sometimes in a funny way, but always trying to say something true. Even then, he knew what was right and wrong. He hated cruelty. He hated slavery and the way ignorance was used to justify it. Lincoln didn't go to school, but he started to show a keen interest in law. He was fascinated by the idea that battles could be won with words and not fists. He taught himself to write clearly and argue logically. He read every law book he could find. At night, others might be drinking or gambling. Lincoln would be in a room with low light, reading Blackstone's commentaries by candlelight. By the time he was 20, he had left home for good. He worked as a boatman on the Mississippi River, where he saw the terrible slave trade in New Orleans. He would always remember those images. They were too shocking to forget. When he returned, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and started to give himself a new identity. He taught himself grammar, joined the local debating society, and, through sheer force of will, began the long journey toward becoming a lawyer. He didn't have a diploma or a degree, and he didn't come from a rich background. He just thought that knowledge was power, and that you could achieve anything in life if you put in the effort and had a clear vision. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer, he was already famous in Central Illinois. It's not about prestige, it's about presence. He wasn't the type of man who would walk into a room and demand attention by wearing expensive clothes or being charming. He was often untidy, his trousers too short and his coat ill-fitting. But when he stood to speak, people listened. He had something more valuable than fashion: clarity, honesty, and relatability. Lincoln's legal career was not the usual path. He didn't go to law school. He read law books that he borrowed from kind lawyers and passed the bar exam by himself. After he was accepted, he started working in the 8th Judicial Circuit, which was a large group of rural courts that he traveled to by horseback, sometimes for weeks at a time. The roads were muddy in the spring, dusty in the summer, and icy in the winter. He slept in different places like taverns, log cabins, and even under the stars. But he loved it. What made Lincoln stand out in court wasn't just his logic. It was his ability to understand others' feelings. He could connect with jurors in a way that even the most experienced lawyers couldn't. He would speak clearly, tell exciting stories, and show respect to everyone, no matter how important they were. One farmer said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not better than us." And that was true. Lincoln never forgot where he came from, and he always was honest about who he was. But he wasn't soft. When it mattered, in court, he never gave up. His speeches were sometimes slow and awkward, but they got better and more exciting. He would lay down facts one after another, until the other side gave in because they were contradicting themselves. The questions he asked were tricky. He would make witnesses feel comfortable and then ask them a question that would make them forget everything they had said. Over time, Lincoln became known as Honest Abe. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It was earned. He would give back the fees if he thought the case was unfair. He refused to represent people who lied. And when other lawyers cut corners, he simply walked away. People knew him as a lawyer who understood the law and the land. But there was another problem: politics. The law had taught him how people worked. Now, he wanted to help change the system they lived in. As slavery became a more important topic of conversation in the country, Lincoln was about to speak out. Lincoln's first real experience of politics was not very successful. In 1832, when he was only 23, he tried to get into the Illinois state legislature, but was not successful. But he didn't let that stop him. If anything, it made it clear what he needed to do: listen more, learn more, and meet people where they are. 2 years later, he tried again and won. In Springfield, the new capital, Lincoln quickly became famous for his calm speeches, sharp humor, and strong moral beliefs. He didn't shout. He didn't make plans. But when he stood up in the State House and spoke, people remembered it. He wasn't interested in easy wins or big promises. His goal was more important: knowing how the law, society, and justice work together. Lincoln joined the Republican Party, a group that wanted to make changes to the country, build better roads and railways, and limit the power of the president. But even as a Whig, he was still cautious about ambition. He often joked about being too ugly to be a politician. He read a lot, took part in lively debates, but never seemed to want to be in charge like other men did. If anything, he seemed to see politics as something he had to do rather than something he wanted to do. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln made friends with farmers, merchants, and other lawyers. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he was often trusted the most. He became known for his strong beliefs, especially when it came to slavery. He wasn't yet calling for the abolition of slavery, but he was firmly opposed to its spreading to new areas. He said it was unfair, wrong, and hypocritical. In 1846, Lincoln entered national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stance against the Mexican-American War, calling it unconstitutional and unnecessary. This wasn't a smart move politically. His local area wasn't happy about it. He was in office for 1 term only and did not stand for re-election. When he went back to Springfield, he went back to his law job. He also married Mary Todd, a clever woman from a family that owned slaves in Kentucky, and he tried to live a quieter life. But the nation was changing very quickly. The 1850 Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the expansion of slavery were causing great disagreement in the country. Lincoln might have left politics, but politics hadn't left him. The debates were getting louder and louder, and more violent. The Union was starting to break apart, and the man who was known for being careful was about to become a voice of reason. By the 1850s, people were starting to take action against slavery. It boiled. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. This led to fierce violence and even deeper division. Bleeding Kansas became a symbol of chaos. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a turning point. He had to speak up. He came back into politics, not with big talk, but with a strong sense of urgency about the moral issues. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a group made up of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, all united against the growth of slavery. Lincoln wasn't a radical abolitionist. He didn't demand that slavery be abolished straight away, but he strongly believed that it was wrong and that allowing it to spread into new states was dangerous and unfair. In 1858, he became famous when he ran for a seat in the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most famous politicians in America. The 2 men agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, and what followed became one of the most famous political showdowns in American history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas supported the idea that each state should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Lincoln replied in a very clear way. He said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. If slavery spread any further, it would cause the Union to fall apart. He said that the country couldn't survive if it was half slave and half free. He didn't win that race for a seat in the Senate, but he did win something greater. He got the attention of the whole country. His words were printed in newspapers all over the country. People who had never heard of Lincoln before now whispered about the tall lawyer from Illinois with the deep-set eyes and strong beliefs. Even though he lost, he had shown that he was good at it. He stood up to one of the best speakers of the time and never backed down. He wanted the nation to be uncomfortable, not to get something for himself. Lincoln thought very hard about the problem on his own. He once wrote, that if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. But he also knew that rushing things could break the fragile relationship. But the die was cast. The national mood was changing, and Lincoln was rising with it. He is not a politician who gives easy answers, but a voice of moral clarity in a time of moral confusion. By 1860, America was on the brink of civil war. Sectional tensions had reached a breaking point. Slavery was not just a question of what was right and wrong anymore. It was a big political problem. The Southern states said they would leave the Union. The Republican Party had to find a leader who could bring the Northern states together without starting a war straight away. That unlikely figure was Abraham Lincoln. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he was not the favorite to win. Most people thought that the nomination would go to Senator William Seward of New York, a skilled and experienced politician. But Lincoln was different from the others. He had a good reputation, spoke in a moderate way, and had impressed people with his debates with Douglas. His team campaigned hard behind the scenes, talking about his history as a country bumpkin and how honest he is. People saw Lincoln as a man who had made himself what he was by himself, and who had started from nothing. His background was not a disadvantage. They were a symbol of what America could do. After 3 votes, he was chosen, and the political world was surprised. The general election was bitter and fractured. The Democratic Party was split in two, with the Northern and Southern groups supporting different candidates. Lincoln's name wasn't on most ballots in the Southern states, but in the North and West, he had a lot of supporters. On November 6, 1860, he was elected as the 16th President of the United States. He won with just 40% of the popular vote, but he had a lot more electoral votes. He didn't celebrate. The mood was actually quite bad. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. 6 more Southern states followed before Lincoln even took office. The country was falling apart more quickly than anyone had thought. Before he went to Washington, D.C. for his first meeting as president, Lincoln received death threats every day. Some people thought he wouldn't survive the journey. Security was so strict that he had to enter the Capitol secretly at night, wearing a disguise and without warning. This was not the arrival of a winner. It was the hesitant arrival of a newly elected president whose election had caused a rift in the Union. When Lincoln finally officially became president on March 4th, 1861, he found a country divided, angry, and armed. But in his speech, he didn't look for revenge. He looked for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." But the signs of war were already clear. Less than a month after Abraham Lincoln became president, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. This was the bloodiest conflict in American history. It was a tough test of the military, Lincoln's character, leadership skills, and determination. Lincoln didn't have a military background. He had briefly been a captain in the Black Hawk War, but he had never been in a fight. Now he was in charge of a nation at war with itself. He spent long nights at the War Ministry reading telegrams, studying maps, and learning about the strategy as he went along. He read books on warfare, questioned his generals, and spent a lot of time thinking about troop movements. He wasn't naturally a warrior, but he had to become one. He was frustrated during the early part of his time as president. One general after another let him down. George Mellon was a popular leader with the troops, but he was also very cautious. Lincoln was fed up with the delays and excuses. He said, "If General Mellon doesn't want to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a bit." But Lincoln's real genius wasn't just in making decisions on the battlefield. It was in my vision. He understood that this war wasn't just about states' rights or secession. It was about what makes the nation feel alive. Could a country that was built on freedom survive being half enslaved? At first, Lincoln was careful about slavery because he was afraid that if he was too aggressive about getting rid of it, the border states might join the Confederacy. But as the war continued and more people were killed, his way of thinking changed. The moral issue and the military one became the same. He said that slavery was the key to the Confederate economy and morale. If it wasn't destroyed, the rebellion would never die. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy to be free. It didn't free everyone straight away, but it changed everything. The war was now about more than just keeping the Union together. It was a fight for human freedom. This meant that countries like Britain and France would no longer support the Confederacy. In the U.S., it gave black men the right to join the Union Army, which thousands did. They fought for a country that had not given them citizenship. Lincoln had changed a lot since he was a simple lawyer. He had become a wartime president, and he used his authority and his strong moral character to lead the country. As the war went on for 4 years, Lincoln was the only one in charge. He was getting thinner, grayer, and older. Every day, there were new lists of people who had been hurt or killed. Towns became graveyards. He received letters from sad mothers and wives, each wanting to know why their sons and husbands had died. And even though he never fought in a war, Lincoln carried the war in his eyes and on his shoulders. The people he chose to be in his government included people who had run against him in the past and did not always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a maestro, balancing ambition with purpose. He didn't use fear or force to rule. He ruled with patience, stories, and clarity. Even his critics had to admit that he was a tough guy. Then came Gettysburg. The battle in July 1863 was a turning point. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing in just 3 days. Months later, Lincoln went to Pennsylvania to give a short speech at the new cemetery. It wasn't meant to be big news, just a short reflection. But in just 272 words, he changed the purpose of the war. This nation, with its strong religious beliefs, will experience a new era of freedom. The government will be made up of the people, working for the people, and will last forever. The Gettysburg Address wasn't exaggerated. It was calm, respectful, and timeless. It made it obvious that this war wasn't just about being united. It was about making things right again, turning the nation into what it had always said it wanted to be. As the 1864 presidential election got closer, Lincoln faced a lot of opposition. The war was still going on, and he was losing support. Some people in his own party even wanted him to be replaced on the ballot. Many people thought he would lose to George Miller, the Democrat candidate, even though he had fired him. But as Union forces won more battles late that year, especially when General Sherman captured Atlanta, public opinion turned in favor of Lincoln. He was reelected with a big enough majority to be sure of his position. But Lincoln didn't brag about it. "I don't like to beat people," he said. The war was almost won, but Lincoln knew that peace would be more difficult. The Union could be rebuilt with muskets, but to rebuild the nation's soul would take something much deeper: mercy, vision, and healing. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. One city after another fell. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was burning. General Robert E. Lee's army did not have enough supplies, soldiers, or time. But Lincoln didn't seem happy. Victory for him was never about punishment. It was about fixing things up. In his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, Lincoln spoke not as a winner, but as a philosopher. He said that he didn't want to hurt anyone, but he was determined to do the right thing. He said that God had given us the ability to see what was right, so let's try our best to finish the work we are doing. These were not the words of a politician looking to defeat his opponents. They were the words of a father trying to save his broken family. On April 9th, Lee gave himself up to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been kept safe. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. For the first time in hundreds of years, the nation took a small step towards the ideals it had said it believed in back in 1776. But just as the country was starting to relax, disaster struck. Just 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln went to see a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the performance, John W. Booth, an actor and someone who supported the Confederacy, got into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865. The whole country was in mourning. Black Americans, many of whom had just been freed, cried in the streets. Even in the South, people who had been enemies before realized how much they had lost. He had been their best hope for peace, a man who never saw politics as war and never let hatred grow in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see the country being rebuilt or to see the wounds his presidency had exposed start to heal. But his death made him more than just a leader. It made him a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From the dirt floor of a cabin in Kentucky to the highest office in the land, Abraham Lincoln rose without money, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led his country through its darkest hour. He wasn't the most intelligent leader, but he was determined and showed people a way forward. The story of America is still marked by the memory of the assassin's bullet. When we think about the ancient world, we usually imagine great empires, beautiful temples, and huge battles. But we rarely think about how they pooped. But cleanliness, or the lack of it, had a big effect on daily life, just like kings and wars. People had to clean up the mess behind every marble palace or clay brick home. Back then, before we had flush buttons or scented sprays, this was a much more public and strong practice than we like to admit. In the ancient world, toilets weren't just about comfort. They were about survival. Human waste carries disease, and when it's not managed properly, as it often was, whole communities suffer. There were many cases of descent, cholera, and parasitic infections, which were like invisible killers. In cities where there was no sanitation, waste flowed through the streets, soaked into wells, and stuck to people's sandals. But in places that took sanitation seriously, something remarkable happened. People lived longer, diseases were less common, and cities grew bigger and more successful. Surprisingly, some of the world's oldest civilizations developed systems that wouldn't look entirely out of place today. The Indus Valley cities had street drainage and brick toilets. The Manawans built ceramic pipes and mechanisms for flushing. The Romans were very good at managing waste. And while other societies like the Vikings or the early Chinese dynasties may have been a bit more basic, even they had their own ways of thinking about health, modesty, and the natural world. But let's be clear, in the past, toilets were not always private, clean, or respectful. It was normal for lots of people to share a toilet, especially in military camps or big cities. Picture 20 stone holes in a row with no dividers between them. Everyone is seated very close together, gossiping or arguing while doing their business. Everyone passed around sponges on sticks. Water was used to rinse, but not always to flush. And below it all, quite literally, were the earliest forms of sewers, cesspits, open ditches used for waste, and sometimes just open ditches. Sanitation is a way to see what a society values. When people didn't take care of it, chaos followed. Wherever it was made, society flourished. If you look past the dirt, you'll see a hidden history, one where we can learn more about ancient life from pipes, pits, and poop than we could from monuments. Long before the Romans built aqueducts or the Greeks thought about public baths, the people of the Indus Valley were already dealing with one of civilization's biggest problems: cleanliness. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which are now in modern-day Pakistan, were surprisingly advanced in their urban planning, particularly when it came to managing human waste. They were built around 2600 BCE. At first, the remains of these ancient cities might just look like old ruins. But if you look closely, you'll see a very organized network of brick-lined streets with the same measurements. Most impressively, there are drainage systems running alongside them. Yes, while many other people were still digging holes in the ground, the Indies people had figured out how to keep their cities flowing and their homes clean. Even simple houses had a small room for washing, often with a squat toilet or a bathing area connected to a vertical chute. This led to a covered brick drain outside, which then joined the larger public sewers. These are not just basic ditches. They were designed with inspection holes, slopes, and brick baffles to catch solids. Some scholars think that the waste from richer homes was flushed using jars of water, with gravity doing the rest. And the genius didn't stop at toilets. The Indies system also separated storm water from waste. There were public wells on the streets. We don't know for sure how they made sure the water was safe, but the fact that they had toilets shows that they cared a lot about people's health, which was unusual at the time. The most amazing thing about these cities is that there are no palaces or temples. The Indies people were more interested in a quality and practical urban infrastructure than in religious buildings, and their toilet systems show this. It is practical, common, and surprisingly democratic. Unfortunately, there is still a lot we do not know about the Indus civilization. We still don't know how to read their writing. We also don't know exactly why their cities declined. But their toilets, the silent brick channels buried beneath their feet, still speak volumes. In an age when many empires ruled through spectacle, the Indies chose something quieter, cleaner, and more civilized. While the Indus Valley built underground sewers, the ancient Egyptians had a different approach to sanitation. This was based on rituals and a strong belief in physical and spiritual purity. For them, cleanliness was about more than just avoiding disease. It was a way of showing respect and devotion. In ancient Egypt, the Nile-fed civilization had a daily routine of bathing, especially for the wealthy. The homes of the rich often had small limestone basins or bathing rooms where servants would pour water for washing. Oils, natron, a natural salt, and perfumed ointments were commonly used, and hair removal was routine. But when it came to toilets, things got a little more practical. In ancient Egypt, toilets were very simple, often just pits lined with sand. But some had more fancy toilets, with seats made of limestone or wood above ceramic pots. Servants or slaves would empty the pots and dump them far from the living quarters, ideally into the desert. In richer homes, these seats might be kept in private rooms, showing that cleanliness is starting to be linked to how important a person is. But there were hardly any public toilets. In cities like Thebes or Memphis, the streets were often dirty. Sometimes, waste was used as fertilizer in the countryside, but it wasn't always managed properly in the cities. Instead, the focus was on personal cleanliness. Priests, for example, had to bathe several times a day, shave, and avoid anything that was impure. They couldn't enter temples without first performing a ritual wash, which sometimes included enemas. This wasn't for health reasons, but as a spiritual preparation. It is interesting to note that, on occasion, the tombs of pharaohs and nobles included toilet stools among the other objects they were buried with. It seems the ancient Egyptians thought that even in the afterlife, people still needed to do their business and do it with dignity. The Egyptians also tried to control pests. People used amulets, spells, and ointments to protect themselves from flies and other diseases. This meant that cleanliness was important in the physical world as well as in the spiritual world. In short, while Egypt didn't build big sewers, it was one of the first places to make a big deal out of cleanliness. Their extreme focus on purity had a big impact on medicine, religion, and everyday life. Their toilets might have been simple, but they were very clean. While most of Europe was still living in caves, the Minoans of Crete were living in underground dwellings. Yes, it's a case of flushing. The Minoan civilization was a very advanced society that existed between 2000 and 400 BC. It is famous for its sophisticated plumbing system, which was one of the most advanced in the ancient world. The city of Knossos was home to more than just labyrinth myths and frescoes. It also had multi-story buildings with running water and toilets that worked. The Minoans knew something that many other civilizations wouldn't discover for hundreds of years: how gravity and water pressure work. Their palaces had special pipes under the floors and inside the walls. These pipes took rainwater and spring water and sent it to fountains, baths, and latrines. In the Queen's Megaron of Knos, archaeologists discovered what might be the oldest known flush toilet. It was made of a wooden seat over a stone bowl, connected to a vertical pipe that could be flushed with water poured in from a container. Bathing was also a high priority. The Minoans built large ceramic bathtubs, similar to those found in modern homes. Water could be supplied from tanks or aqueducts on the roof and drained through underground channels. Some people even suggest that U-shaped water traps, which are a type of trap, were used to block odors. This idea is still being discussed. It's interesting how these systems were used in rich homes, as it suggests that having them was a way of showing off. Unlike later Roman latrines, which were public and shared, Minoan sanitation was private. Your toilet was in your own home, which was a luxury that many people in Europe in the 19th century did not have. The Minoans weren't just practical, they were stylish too. Their bathrooms were decorated with colorful fresco and elegant plasterwork. It seems that sanitation can be both practical and stylish. Unfortunately, the Minoan civilization fell around 1450 BCE for reasons that are still not fully understood. These might have been volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions. Whatever the reason, this was when many of these innovations were lost. It would take over 1,000 years for similar toilet technology to reappear in other parts of the Mediterranean. But the ruins of Knos tell a simple truth. The desire to stay clean, get rid of waste, and bathe in privacy isn't a modern obsession. It's very old, very human, and in the case of the Minoans, very advanced. When it comes to ancient sanitation, no civilization made a bigger or bolder statement than the Romans. By the time the Roman Empire was at its most powerful, they had mastered building things like aqueducts, roads, and toilets. For the Romans, sanitation was about more than just cleanliness. It was about civilization itself. This meant making toilets public, efficient, and, surprisingly, social. If you walk into any big Roman city from Pompeii to London, you would probably find public toilets, open rooms with long stone benches, each carved with evenly spaced holes. There are no stalls or dividers. It's just a big, packed seating area. Under the benches, there is a steady stream of water that carried away waste, and a second channel held sponge sticks. Tessauria is like toilet paper, but Roman. These sponges were rinsed together in water and vinegar, then reused. Is it clean? Not quite. Is it useful? That's right. For the Romans, using the toilet wasn't a private matter. It was a social event. People chatted, talked about other people, did business, and also used the toilet. Latrines were often decorated with mosaics or inscriptions, some of them humorous or even rude. Graffiti inside Pompeii's public toilets includes complaints about bad smells, poor plumbing, and rude users. But Roman sanitation was about more than just toilets. Their cities were full of cloaca. There are huge sewer systems. the most famous of which is the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. It was built to drain the marshes, and over time it became the main way the Romans got rid of their rubbish. Rainwater, urine, and feces all flowed through it, fed by aqueducts that brought in fresh water for miles away. In rich people's houses, they had indoor toilets that emptied into a hole in the ground or straight into the sewers. The poor people who didn't have access to toilets relied on chamber pots, which are sometimes thrown away from windows into the street, even though it was against the law. People living in apartments, especially in multi-story buildings, suffered the worst. Many buildings had no plumbing at all, and sewage often flooded the lower floors. It's interesting that the ancient Romans taxed urine. Emperor Vespasian even introduced a tax on public urinals, a move so infamous that people still associate his name with urinals in France and Italy today. In short, Roman toilets were not just advanced. They were loud, crowded, political, and strangely progressive. This could be the first time that such a big project has been done in a way that everyone can use it. The Romans liked to go to the toilet in public, like at a picnic, but the ancient Greeks were more modest. They thought that bodily functions were personal and should be handled quietly and discreetly, and preferably alone. But they still made important contributions to sanitation and cleanliness, just in a very different way. In most Greek homes, the toilet was simple, a clay pot or stone seat over a cesspit. There were no flushing systems or sewer connections in ordinary residences. The waste was usually collected and emptied by hand, often by slaves, into pits or dumped in remote areas. In the city, there were sometimes open drains on the streets, but as the city grew, the smell got worse. Sanitation was a problem, but it was not always a priority. But the Greeks were obsessed with bathing. Gymnasia, where men exercised naked, were almost always connected to large public baths. They weren't just for getting rid of sweat. They were important places in society where people could meet, discuss ideas, and get ready to take part in civic life. Roman baths were extravagant and filled with marble, but Greek baths were simpler. They were often circular tubs, cold water basins, or shallow pools. Managing water was very important for this culture of bathing. The Greeks built aqueducts, systems, and terracotta pipe systems to supply fresh water to cities like Athens. The Athenian agora had one of the first public toilets, with stone seats and a drainage system. But these were rare. In Greece, public toilets were never really accepted in society the way they were in Rome. The Greeks may not have been great at plumbing, but they more than made up for it with their ideas. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, was among the first to link cleanliness to health. He suggested that dirty water and filth could spread disease, which was a radical idea at the time. He recommended that people should live in clean air, fresh water, and dry housing. This was important for their health. Later, this became an important part of planning Roman cities. The irony is obvious. The civilization that gave us democracy and drama still prefer to handle its most private business in public. For the Greeks, sanitation was not just about having the right buildings and equipment. It was about having self-discipline and being open-minded, a clean body and mind. And even though their toilets might have been basic, their strong belief in purity, both physical and moral, helped create the ideas that led to modern public health. In ancient China, cleanliness was important for personal hygiene and a way of life that reflected the natural world. Even though sanitation was not as much a part of everyday life as in Rome or the Indus Valley, it was still very important. This was because it was a part of people's daily lives through customs, philosophies, and a wide range of toilet tools. In the past, most Chinese homes did not have toilets like we have today. Instead, chamber pots were the norm. These portable ceramic or bronze containers came in all shapes and sizes, from everyday to fancy, depending on how important the person was. After use, servants or family members would empty the pots into larger household cesspits or take them outside the city walls. In the past, some families who lived in the countryside used human waste as a fertilizer. This was called night soil. There were public toilets, especially in bigger cities like Chang'an or Luoyang. These shared spaces were often just basic holes in the ground with wooden platforms to sit or squat on. Interestingly, some of these toilets had privacy screens, which is a nice touch. This was not often found in ancient Rome. Waste from these places was usually collected and used in farming. This was efficient, but there were also risks of contamination and disease. Toilet paper, or something very similar, may have first been invented in China. As early as the 2nd century BCE, people were using soft papers, often discarded writings, for hygiene. By the 6th century, scholars wrote about using paper specifically for cleaning after going to the toilet. The elite preferred silk scraps or bamboo spatulas that were washed between uses. Yes, you read that correctly. Polished bamboo sticks were some of the first wiping tools that people used more than once. Sanitation wasn't just about physical cleanliness. It was spiritual. The ideas of Confucius, a famous philosopher, about order and respect influenced the beliefs about hygiene. These beliefs were also about harmony and purity. People thought that being clean was linked to being disciplined and balanced. Poo, though natural, was seen as something that pollutes, something to be quickly removed and never talked about in polite company. The imperial households took this to the extreme, with specially appointed eunuchs managing waste disposal in complete secrecy. Even though there were no underground sewers, ancient China had quite clean cities. This was possible because people work hard, there were cultural rules about waste, and there was a good system for collecting rubbish. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The Chinese people developed their own way of keeping things clean, which was simple, effective, and based on long-standing traditions. This involved things like chamber pots, composting, and using paper wipes. When we think about old toilet habits, the Vikings might not be the first people we think of. People are more familiar with the raids and the routines, but Norse hygiene was actually more sophisticated and surprisingly disciplined than stereotypes suggest. The myths about the horned helmet are interesting, but they hide a culture that was, in reality, quite rough. However, they did take personal cleanliness and waste management more seriously than much of medieval Europe. In Viking settlements, archaeologists have found latrine pits lined with timber or stone. These basic functional toilets were used by individuals and households. These pits were often dug close to people's homes and sometimes had wooden covers to provide privacy and protection from the cold northern weather. The waste from these latrines, which contain human excrement, food scraps, and animal remains, tells us more than just what Vikings ate. This suggests that they had a way of getting rid of waste all in one place. Sometimes, these pits were cleaned out and reused. In other places, new pits were simply dug when the old ones filled up. Some evidence even suggests that people used to compost their waste a long time ago. This is because waste would naturally decompose and return to the soil over time. In the past, chamber pots and buckets were used inside homes, especially during long, cold winters when it was not safe to go outside. These were usually emptied into pits or piles of manure near the edge of a village. It may not have been glamorous, but it was practical and much cleaner than throwing waste into the street, which was common in some medieval cities. But cleanliness wasn't just about practicality, it was also about culture. Vikings washed themselves regularly, often once a week, usually on a log. Washing day is the word for Saturday in English. Combs, ear cleaners, and tweezers made from bone or antler are often found in Norse archaeological sites. Personal grooming was important for more than just how someone looked. It was also important for their social status and whether or not they could get married. Viking sanitation wasn't as advanced as that of Rome or Egypt, but it was practical. They didn't invent sewers or toilet paper, but they were able to manage their waste, keep clean, and adapt to a harsh environment using simple, practical solutions. In a land of ice and iron, even the business of going to the toilet was done quickly and efficiently. No matter what culture or time period you look at, there's one thing that always stays the same. No society can survive without knowing what to do with its waste. From the hidden sewers of the Indus Valley to the communal toilets of ancient Rome and the chamber pots of ancient China, humanity's relationship with sanitation has always been a delicate balance between necessity and neglect. It's interesting how different cultures prioritized hygiene. Some, like the Romans and Minoans, spent a lot of money on infrastructure. They built things like aqueducts, flush systems, and sewage networks. In some cases, these were just as good as the systems in 19th century cities. In contrast, other cultures, like those of the Greeks and Chinese, viewed cleanliness as a personal virtue. They believed that it was linked to good health, ethics, and living in harmony with nature. Some people, like the Vikings, were practical. Dig a hole to bury waste, wash when you can, and keep your food clean. Even though these societies were different, they were all trying to do the same thing: keep people from getting rid of their rubbish. There were many reasons for this, such as preventing disease, honoring the gods, and maintaining public order. But the outcome shaped how cities grew, how laws were made, and how people viewed their bodies. It's interesting that a lot of this old knowledge was forgotten during the Middle Ages in Europe. After the Roman Empire fell, the city's toilets and sewers stopped working properly, and diseases spread quickly. It would take hundreds of years and lots of plagues for people who planned cities to take up ideas that the ancients had already mastered. But you can still see traces of old toilet habits in the present day. The word latrine comes from the Latin latrina. The modern flush toilet is very similar to the gravity-fed toilet that was used a long time ago. Even using paper in the bathroom was first done by the Chinese over 1,000 years ago. What's considered modern today is often just a revival of something from the past. It is often forgotten in stories about the past, but cleanliness is an important part of life. It doesn't make people want to write poems or build monuments. But without it, cities fall, people suffer, and even empires can fall. Next time you use a toilet and enjoy being private, having clean water, and maybe even soap, remember that people before you worked hard to find ways to stay clean. This is perhaps the most underrated achievement of our civilization. Even before we had satellites, compasses, or writing, humans had an instinct to map the world. It was important to record where things were, but also to understand their place in a big and often scary world. A map isn't just a picture of the land. It was a story, a belief system, a way of surviving. It told people where the rivers flowed, where the sun rose, where the spirits lived, and where danger waited just beyond the known. Some of the earliest maps weren't drawn on parchment or paper. They were written on stone, scratched on a bone, or remembered by word of mouth. Prehistoric carvings from the Upper Paleolithic period, which are over 14,000 years old, show animals, riverbanks, and groups of huts. Were they like maps today? Not quite, but they captured space in relation to movement and meaning. It's a basic start. As human societies started to grow and trade routes got bigger, maps became very important. They helped merchants travel through mountains and deserts. They helped kings draw borders and tax their subjects. They even tried to explain the universe, combining astronomy with religion. To map the stars was to touch the divine. Drawing a city was about creating order from chaos. But mapping wasn't always about accuracy. In fact, Ancient maps were often very different from maps made today. What mattered was the meaning, not the measurement. The center of the world was always home, whether that was Babylon, Jerusalem, or the island of Dos. Lands grew or shrank depending on how important they were. The lands that no one knew about were full of magical creatures or marked with a sign saying, "Beware of dragons." Some cultures didn't even use flat maps. Polynesian sailors, for example, made stick charts that showed ocean currents and sea swells. They didn't make them for what you can see, but for what you can feel. People didn't read these like modern maps. Instead, they felt and memorized them through ritual training. The human instinct to map, to visualize space, time, and position is deeply ingrained. Maps were important for ancient people because they helped them understand the world around them, their gods, and each other. They could be made from clay, painted on walls, or just sung. And even though they had very different ways of doing things, they were always trying to find their place in a strange and always changing world. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first civilizations were born, the Babylonians started making the first known maps out of clay. These were more than just useful for owning land or planning cities. They were like documents from another planet. They tried to create order from chaos by using lines and symbols to make pictures. One of the best known examples is the Imago Mundi, a clay tablet dating back to the 6th century BCE, which is now kept in the British Museum. It is often said to be the oldest known world map. It is only 6 inches across, so it doesn't give much of a view of the Babylonian universe. The image shows the city of Babylon in the middle. It is a rectangle, and the circle around it shows the known world. The Euphrates River runs through the middle of the map, and various cities, mountains, and regions are labeled in the same way. Beyond the world, there is a bitter river, which is probably the ocean, and then mysterious triangular islands, each with descriptions from mythology. These weren't real places. They were places that represented chaos and danger, and were the limits of what we could understand. To the Babylonians, mapping was about more than just geography. It was spiritual. The sky was mapped just as carefully as the ground. The Babylonians were very good at tracking the movements of planets, the moon, and eclipses. Everything was written on clay tablets using special pens. These records about space weren't just for scientists. They were used to predict good or bad omens and divine the future. The map of the sky was a way to understand what was going to happen. On a smaller scale, land surveys were common and practical. Clay tablets from as early as 2300 BC record plots of farmland with notes on boundaries, irrigation canals, and ownership. These were the tools used by bureaucrats, tax collectors, and priests. Precision was important here, not for navigation, but for managing wealth and resources. Babylonian maps show that they were obsessed with structure in more ways than one. They mapped the world as they understood it. They saw themselves as the center of the world, surrounded by rivers, enemies, gods, and mysteries. These maps were more than just records. They were a way of showing belief, power, and a desire to make the unknown a little more known. While the Babylonians mapped the world with mythical rings and cosmic rivers, the ancient Egyptians focused on something more down to earth, the land itself. In the floodplains of the Nile, mapping wasn't abstract. It was about control, survival, and the sacred geometry of a kingdom that stretched from desert cliffs to delta marshes. The Egyptians did not make world maps in the way that the Babylonians did. Their photography was very practical. Every year, the Nile flooded, causing the markers and farmland divisions to disappear. To restore order, surveyors called Harperdon used ropes, measuring rods, and sighting tools to redraw the grid. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was something that had to be done every year. Mapping became a state job, closely managed by temple scribes and royal officials. The maps of Papi show us the area in great detail. One of the oldest known is the Turin papyrus map, which was made around 1160 BC. It's not for show or made-up stories. It's a map of a mining area. It shows the layout of the area, including wadis, dry river valleys, hills, and areas where gold can be found in the eastern desert. It also shows streams, roads, quarry sites, and notes in hieratic script that indicate distances and mineral types. This was a working map for officials and labor crews, not something displayed on a palace wall. But Egyptian maps weren't just random. Temples were often built to match celestial events, and cities were laid out following a cosmic order. The map was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of Mahat, the Egyptian idea of balance and harmony. The division of land and planning for cities was based on sacred principles. Even pyramids and tombs were built using maths and astronomy. Religious texts also include pictures of the underworld, like those in the Book of the Dead or the Amdat. These spiritual maps showed the journey of the soul through 12 hours of darkness, with serpents, gods, and gates protecting it. They weren't navigational, but they were like a map, guiding the dead through the afterlife. The Egyptian writing system was a combination of bureaucracy and belief. Maps were important for measuring land or recording information about the afterlife. They weren't just about finding one's way on Earth. They were about making sure they were in tune with the gods. The Greeks didn't invent maps, but they changed how people thought about them. For the first time ever, space wasn't just described. It was measured, calculated, and thought about. Geography went from being something you needed to do to something you thought about, which set the stage for modern geography. Anaximandanda was a philosopher from Midas. He is thought to have created one of the first conceptual maps of the world in the 6th century BCE. The original has been lost, but sources describe it as a disc shaped like a circle. Land masses like Europe and Asia are spread around a central Mediterranean. It was a symbol, but it also marked a break from old beliefs about the world. Anaximander was trying to show the world in a logical way. Then Hecatus came along and developed these ideas further through travel and research. His map was also with a book called Paradisius, which gave information about the lands, their people, and their customs. But it was Claudius Ptolemy centuries later who completely changed the game. Ptolemy's Geography CE was a great work of Greek science. It had instructions for making maps, a list of over 8,000 place names with coordinates, and a grid-based system of latitude and longitude, long before GPS was even invented. He also came up with a way to show the curved shape of the Earth on a flat surface, which is still used by many computer graphics today. Greek maps were more than just practical tools. They also show how the Greeks saw the world. The world was covered in oceans and wildlands, but the Greeks thought of themselves as the smartest people. The further away from Greece, the more inaccurate the map is. This is because people have limited knowledge and cultural biases. Interestingly, Greek thinkers also thought about whether the Earth was round. Aratos of Syracuse was a mathematician who worked in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. He used shadows, geometry, and a stick to work out the circumference of the Earth. He was very accurate, with an error of only a few hundred miles. The art of Greek writing was about more than just drawing lines. It was about understanding how big the Earth is, how it looks, and where it is in space. The Greeks used maths, logic, and ambition to turn maps from myth into science, and the world was never the same again. The Greeks came up with the idea of writing, and the Romans used it to plan and execute military campaigns. The Roman Empire wasn't just kept together by laws and armies. It was stitched into one unit by a large and well-maintained road network. And to keep it working, the Romans created some of the most practical and powerful maps of the ancient world. Roman maps were different from Greek maps. Greek maps try to show the shape of the earth or explore space. Roman maps were all about movement. They were used to control people, to expand the empire, to collect taxes, and to provide supplies. The most important thing was the phrase, "All roads lead to Rome." Well, the Romans didn't see it that way. It was a way of thinking about mapping. Perhaps the most famous Roman map is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a 4th century CE copy of an even older Roman road map. It doesn't show the location accurately. The land masses are stretched and distorted, but it works really well, showing routes, stops, distances, and connections across the empire from Britain to India. Picture a subway map today where the exact location isn't as precise, but it's easier to understand where to go. That's basically how Roman mapping worked. Marked way stations or mansions were found at regular intervals, with distances shown in Roman miles. These maps helped military commanders, merchants, and messengers travel efficiently across thousands of kilometers. They knew where to change horses, where to rest, and how long it would take to reach the next city. The empire became navigable not just on land, but also on paper. As well as road maps, the Romans also had very detailed maps of land ownership and boundaries. These were used for tax and legal disputes. Some are made of bronze and put up in public places so that citizens could see exactly who owned what. The Romans knew that whoever controlled the land controlled the power. The Romans were less interested in mapping the whole earth or the heavens. They were always thinking about what they could conquer, travel, or tax. The map wasn't a vision of the whole universe. It was a spreadsheet with roads on it. Roman maps made the empire easy to understand. This created a feeling of shared space and belonging to something bigger than your town or tribe. It was a well-designed empire. It was practical, detailed, and very efficient. Roman maps focused on roads and how the land was organized. In contrast, ancient Chinese writing was all about how the land and its people fit together with the universe. In China, maps were never just about showing geography. They were political documents, philosophical statements, and mirrors that showed the heavens. Mapping the land was a way to understand one's place in the world and to rule it properly. Some of the earliest known Chinese maps date back to the 4th century BCE and were found in tombs like the one at Mondui. These silk maps show rivers, roads, and military positions. They are not drawn to scale, but they are very detailed for the time they were made. They weren't designed for people who travel a lot. They were buried with the dead, perhaps to guide the spirit or to show that the person had owned land. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, cartography had developed. Officials used maps to manage the empire's huge territories, keep a record of the tax zones, and plan military campaigns. Surveying tools like the groma and sighting instruments helped measure land very accurately. Some old hand maps even included coordinate grids, centuries before they appeared in the West. P. Shu was a famous Chinese geographer who lived in the 3rd century CE. He set out rules for how to make scientific maps, focusing on how big they are, which direction they go in, and making sure the measurements are always the same. These were ideas that would later be used as the basis for Chinese and Korean mapping traditions. People really admired his work, so much so that he was given the nickname Father of Chinese Photography. But Chinese maps weren't just about Earth. Charts showing the universe were very important. The Chinese sky was mapped using constellations grouped into celestial palaces and symbolic animals, such as the azure dragon of the east and the white tiger of the west. These star maps were used for everything from farming to imperial rituals. The emperor was the son of heaven, and people believed that he should rule in a way that matched the order of the heavens. If his maps, and by extension, his governance fell out of harmony, It meant that he no longer had the right to rule. In China, the map was more than just a tool for bureaucrats. It was a bridge between heaven and earth. Maps were more than just pictures of land. They could be carved into stone, painted on silk, or etched into bronze. It showed that the emperor could make sense of the chaos of the world. The Polynesians lived far away from the big countries of Eurasia. They developed their own special way of mapping the world. This way was very different from the way other people had done it before. It didn't use paper, ink, or scales. Instead, it used people's knowledge and memory. These were the stick charts of the Marshall Islands, and they represented a very different way of understanding geography, not by land, but by sea. The Polynesians were very good at finding their way around the sea. Thousands of years before European explorers crossed the Atlantic, they were sailing huge parts of the Pacific, using stars, waves, birds, and clouds to find their way. They had no compasses or written language, so their maps had to work differently. Not as static images, but as memory aids and tactile guides for novice navigators. Stick charts were built from thin coconut fronds or wooden strips lashed together with twine. The curves represented ocean swells, which behaved in a predictable way in open water. Small shells are not like islands. The arrangement of the sticks showed how waves can be refracted and interfere with each other. This knowledge let navigators read the ocean surface like a road map. There were different types of charts. Rebel charts covered large areas, while Meadow focused on smaller regions or specific journeys. Then there were Matong, which are abstract teaching tools used to explain wave behavior near islands. These weren't meant to be carried on long journeys. Instead, they were studied, memorized, and understood. A skilled navigator could cross hundreds of miles using only their senses and what they had learned from the stick chart. To the untrained eye, these maps look like broken ladders or art installations. But to someone who uses them to navigate the islands of Polynesia, they represent a deep knowledge of nature that comes from a close and respectful relationship with it, not from conquest or geometry. Polynesian cartography went against the Western idea that a map has to be visual and literal. Their maps were physical, experiential, and often invisible during travel. It wasn't about recording space. It was about feeling it. These charts often mixed science and spirituality. They were passed down through word of mouth, protected by navigation schools, and treated with respect. And in an ocean that could swallow even the boldest sailor, they helped the Polynesians find their way, not just across water, but through memory, rhythm, and knowledge passed down through their families. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, maps started to change from being based on scientific observation to being based on symbols. In many parts of the world, especially in Europe, photography started to be used more to represent spiritual truths and less to show what things looked like in real life. The result was maps full of monsters, paradise, demons, and a worldview where the center of geography was often the center of belief. One of the most well-known types of medieval map is the world map. This type of map was used a lot in Europe from the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance. These maps showed the world as a circle with the letter O divided into 3 parts by a line through the middle. Asia is at the top, Europe is in the lower left corner, and Africa is in the lower right corner. Jerusalem was often at the center of the known world, which made it the most important religious city. People thought that the Garden of Eden was in the east, not the north. These maps weren't made for navigating. They were used to support the idea that the world was created by God and that the places and events in the Bible actually happened in real life. The lands were named after Noah's sons, and the unknown regions beyond these boundaries were home to strange creatures, including people with dog heads, feet like umbrellas, or faces in their chests. The further away from Jerusalem, the stranger things got. But not all medieval maps were just symbols. Some people liked the Rogeriana, a table created by the Arab geographer Al-Raisi in the 12th century. It combined real observations with artistic style. It was commissioned by a Norman king in Sicily. This huge silver map was based on interviews with travelers, traders, and sailors from across the Muslim and Christian worlds. It was much more detailed and practical than the European ones. It was placed at the bottom on the south side, which is a common feature in Islamic art. At the same time, Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions also created conceptual world maps. These maps were not about navigation, but about the metaphysical structure of the world. Mount Mayu, for example, is often shown as the cosmic axis in many Indian and Tibetan maps, with symbolic continents and divine realms around it. These medieval maps teach us that mapping isn't just about where things are. It's about what people believe the world means. In a time when the horizon was full of mystery, the map was more than just a guide. It was a reflection of the soul. As people started to think bigger, they also wanted to capture more. It's not just about getting from one place to another, but also about understanding who we are, where we came from, and what's around us. Ancient maps, with all their flaws, distortions, and symbols, laid the foundation for the modern world's obsession with space, borders, and precision. All ancient maps are similar because they were made for a specific purpose, not because they were accurate. Tablets from Babylon weren't used to help you find street. They showed how the universe is spiritually structured. Maps from ancient Egypt helped people to keep order in a place where there were often floods and gods. Greek maps were the first to show the size of places on Earth, and they made people think about geometry and the idea that the world could be measured. Roman road maps joined together a huge empire, helping legions, messengers, and merchants to move in an organized way. Chinese maps combined astronomy with governance, aiming to show harmony between heaven and earth. Then there were the outliers. The Polynesian stick charts were both tactile and abstract, showing that not all maps had to be seen. Some things were meant to be felt and remembered. Medieval religious maps were full of beasts and paradises. These maps told viewers not just where the world was, but what it meant. Even the floors in old maps can tell you a lot. They show us what mattered to a culture, what was important, what was feared, and what was sacred. These maps show us that geography is not neutral. It shows what is important to people, who has the power, what stories are told, and how people remember things. The Greeks were in the middle of the road. The Chinese did the same. The Europeans did the same. Everyone was busy with their own lives. Today, with satellite imaging and digital precision, we can map the whole planet down to the last meter. The basic idea behind calligraphy has not changed in thousands of years. People need to feel part of something bigger. All maps show the same old question, no matter how they're presented. Where am I?